This week we're starting to read the second book of Chumash, Shemot, what the non-Jews usually call the book of Exodus, which, by the way, may have been our tradition too. I mentioned in another place that the names of the 5 books of the Chumash that the non-Jews use, and that is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, at least 3 of them are mentioned by our sages. So it's clear that this was an alternative Jewish name too. The last 3 books, that's how our sages also called it. Vayikra was also called Torat Kohanim, which is basically Leviticus. The 4th book was called Pikudim, which is basically numbers, census. And the last book is called Mishnah Torah, repeating of the Torah, which is the Deuteronomy. We don't have a clear source with regards to the first 2 books, but it's very possible, very likely, that there was an alternative name for those ones too, and it may have been something similar. So it could be that the way that the Christians usually call these 5 books was also an alternative name that the Jews used in those times. But the more commonly, the more common naming of the 5 books is based on one of the first words in each book. So the second book is called Shemot, meaning names, literally, names, because it starts with a verse. These are the names of the sons of Yaakov that came. I wanted to discuss the beginning of the Jewish slavery, and specifically the comments of a very well-known German rabbi who lived 150 years ago. He died about 150 years ago already, and so his main lifetime was almost closer to 200 years ago. I'm not sure exactly when during his lifetime he wrote the commentary on the 5 books of Moshe. There are other commentaries that he wrote. He wrote a lot of different books in his life, and he was a very prolific writer. He was a big leader in Frankfurt, Germany, and this was the time when the Jews were given rights with other citizens, and it seemed like things were going good for the Jews for the first time in thousands of years. But as you'll see from his comments, as I said, he died already at least 50 years before Hitler came to power, close to half a century before Hitler came to power. So when he's writing all these words, there was no strong anti-Semitism yet, but his words really make a lot of sense, that as a kind of warning and prediction of what can happen. So the verses, of course, describe everything very quickly, in a very short very concise manner, as the verses of the Torah usually do. If the creation of the world is described in just a few verses, you could imagine that the Shibud, the time when the Jewish people, from being proud citizens, became now slaves, all of that is described in just a few short verses. So I'm just reading the comments of Rav Shimshon Rephael Hirsch to verses 8 and 9, more or less. So it says that the new king arose over Egypt, who didn't know Yosef, and he said to his people, "Behold, the children of Israel are greater and mightier than we. Let us use some cunning against them." And that's more or less a translation of these verses. And Rav Shimshon Rephael Hirsch writes as follows. Now, he wrote his commentary in German, but it has been translated into Hebrew and into English. I haven't found on the internet the English translation, but the Hebrew translation is available on the site Al HaTorah. And also there is a German translation in the original that can be found on the site Sefaria. And you could use, I guess, an automatic translator to have an idea of what it says. More or less, the Hebrew that I can see and the English that I can find in the synagogues, there are a lot of synagogues that have his the English translation of his commentary. And what I'm able to get with an automatic translator from German, they more or less correspond to each other. So I don't know German, I cannot read the original, but this is an unusual situation. Most of the commentaries to the Torah are written exclusively in biblical or rabbinical Hebrew. in the ancient Hebrew, not even in modern Hebrew. There are a few recent commentaries that are written in modern Hebrew. There's not a huge difference, of course, but there may be some minor differences. But the vast majority of our commentators that I usually quote in various lessons are written in Old Hebrew, usually rabbinical Hebrew. But Rav Shimshon Rephael Hirsch wrote in classical German. So it's a very unusual situation that you have to have a translation in order to understand what he's saying. So he writes as follows, that the expression "a new king arose over Egypt," according to him, doesn't mean the usual transfer of power, but rather arose in this case, stand up, right? Vayakam, he got up, kind of. It means a kind of rebellion, a revolution of sorts. So it was by force that a new dynasty came to power. It wasn't just a new king, it was a new dynasty. So apparently the previous dynasty fell, and the land of Egypt was conquered by a foreign dynasty. That's what he suggests. He didn't know Yosef. That's why he didn't know Yosef. He was from a foreign place, and everybody in Egypt knew Yosef. But the new king didn't know Yosef, and it's interesting that the hatred of the Jews, as the Torah makes it apparent, came from the fact that this person didn't know Yosef, didn't have any appreciation for what Yosef did. Meaning, according to Rav Shimshon Rephael Hirsch, the people knew about Yosef, and they did not look with suspicion at the Jewish quarter and the growing Jewish people in it. They saw that the Jews as benefactors, not intruders, and they didn't feel disadvantaged by the Jewish success. So what did this new king say? "Behold, the people of Israel, the children of Israel, are great and stronger than us." What does that mean exactly? Were the Egyptians smaller in number than the Jews? Of course not. The Jews were much smaller than the total number of Egyptians. So Rav Shimshon Rephael Hirsch suggests two possibilities. One is that by us, the new Pharaoh meant the people that came with him, the intruders, meaning the new foreign nation. They were not so many in number, and they said that even though we now control most of Egypt, but the Jews, they seem to be multiplying quickly, and it's not so easy to control them. Another possibility that he says is more likely is that there were a lot of different nations within Egypt, many different clans, sects, whatever you call it, and each one was not so big in number. So since Egyptians were not united between themselves, Pharaoh could claim that Jews who are all united, they're very powerful and strong, having one heart, so this nation is very dangerous to any smaller group of Egyptians. So now the main part, because of which I wanted to make this short lesson, the main part comes. So he says that first of all, notice how everything Pharaoh said about the Jews, anything he could use to persecute the Jews, it was only the fact that they're growing fast. He didn't have any other reason to persecute us. If we had been morally bad, if he could say that the Jews are, all the rabbis are Jewish or something like that, he would have said that. None of that he was able to claim. The Jews had good reputation and people knew about it. Jews were morally good. In terms of religious observance, they were not so good. I mean, the Torah wasn't given yet, but whatever the case may be, the Jews already had some traditions from their forefathers. So, for instance, Brit Milah apparently was abandoned at some point. The fact is that religiously we were not so good. But obviously that's not something that would make Pharaoh and his people unhappy. So in terms of socially and as being good citizens, there was nothing he could claim about the Jews. It's a great testimony of social and moral integrity of Jews at that time. Pharaoh could not accuse them of any wrongdoing. So what he claimed then is that the Jews present some kind of a danger to society, that it's a something that is needed. It was a kind of incitement that was coming from up down. The people were not yet anti-Semitic. It was the government that used the Jews. So he says that there's nothing new under the sun. Every time a tyrant sought to oppress his subjects, another people was handed over to them so that they could torture them, receiving compensation for their oppression from above. This policy was the source of many degrees against the Jews throughout history. So Pharaoh sought to compensate the Egyptian people, and to do so, he created a kind of outcast class that all other classes would look down on. Very profound comments, I think, and it's in fact true and was true and became true after the death of Rav Shimshon Rephael Hirsch in Germany and in Stalin by Russia, in Russia by Stalin, and in many other places. This is a common thing. Today, it's, by the way, done on global scale. Israel is made into a kind of pariah state for all the other nations. It's accused of heinous crimes that have nothing to do with the reality. While Israel is trying to preserve the population of Gaza to the extent that it's possible under the circumstances, it's doing better than the Allies did in Mosul and other places fighting ISIS. It's a lot harder to fight in Gaza than in Mosul. And yet Israel is able to preserve a very, very large percentage of Gaza, the regular people. And the fact is that a lot of times the Hamas members are not dressed in specific uniforms and look like regular people. It's very, very hard. They do all kinds of tricks. They sometimes send women with bombs that look like they're just regular Muslim women. It's a very, very complex situation in Gaza. And yet Israel is doing everything possible. They came to the hospital, gave them time to evacuate, brought in incubators for the newborn babies, do all kinds of things in order to save as many people as possible. And yet they're being accused constantly that they're doing genocide. If they wanted to simply bomb Gaza, every place which has rockets, and there's pretty much every kindergarten, every school, every hospital has rockets. So Israel would have had 1 million Gazians dead by the day one of the war. The war wouldn't have been as long. Israel before that used to fight wars that are much shorter with decisive victory almost immediately. But in Gaza specifically, because of so much regular population that are not, at least not members of Hamas, a lot of them support Hamas unfortunately, but they've been brainwashed, and Israel is trying to do the best they can under the circumstances, under incredibly difficult circumstances. Many American and NATO chiefs came and saw what's going on and said that what Israel's soldiers and army is doing, it's much more than any other nation is doing under similar circumstances. And yet they're being blamed. The UN has nothing better to do than constantly push for a ceasefire. What ceasefire? Ceasefire that Hamas will stay in power and they'll repeat October 7th more over and over and over again, torturing, raping, destroying, killing babies. That's what the ceasefire really means, because they said that they're going to repeat it. Okay, they'll keep repeating it. How many Jews do have to die in order for them to be able to fight the genocidal Hamas and save the Gazan citizens themselves from their own Hamas, just like the German people were saved from Nazis? How many Jews have to die? 10,000, 100,000, 1 million? How many Jews have to die in order for them to be able to protect themselves? This is unbelievable. But all these proud nations that themselves wage wars and themselves really committing terrible things, the very nations that are often on top of all kinds of committees in UN investigating Israeli war crimes, so-called. It's really unbelievable what's going on. It's truly unbelievable. But Baruch Hashem, there are also people who do understand. And among Americans in particular, at least the older people, the majority, do have an understanding of what's going on, and thankfully have not gone completely mad like most of the rest of the world. So we're very thankful to at least the Americans that have the clarity to understand the difference between Hamas, which is worse than Nazis. They're worse than Nazis by far in every respect. And the people who are trying to stop this. I hope that Hashem will have mercy on the Jewish people, and eventually peace will come to these lands, including of course, the people who live in Gaza. They will also have a future if, in fact, they abandon terrorism, if they'll be denazified, just like after World War II. The German people had a future. there is definitely a great future that could happen. You could have a Singapore of the Middle East in that area. It's a great area. You could have hotels, you could have tourism, but the condition, the precondition is the desire to live in peace and to spend the money that the world is giving them, not to make tunnels and to make rockets, but in order to live in peace and to build infrastructure. Only then real peace can come. And that's what we hope and pray for.